Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Steve Hewlett. I'm your hapless chair for the next hour. This is a session about the challenges facing the new DG. He is the 15th DG. He needs to achieve 20% more with 20% less. And I can tell you that at the very most senior levels of the trust, the expectation is that he will deliver more radical change than any of the other candidates for the job. Now, when you consider that Ed Richards would have turned up swinging a blood axe around his head, that's quite something. So, there's plenty to talk about. There's a hashtag if you wish to tweet about the session, and we'll be able to see it here. It's hashtag Pentland, as in the name of the auditorium. Now, we don't want to hang around here, so we'll get straight on with it. I'll introduce our panel, and they'll come out together and give them a customary welcome, if you don't mind. Former BBC Director General Greg Dyke, first woman controller of BBC One, now executive chairwoman of her own indie Boom Pictures, Lorraine Hegarty, BAFTA award-winning chief executive of Left Bank Pictures, producers of Wallander and The Queen, Andy Harris, and previous chief executive of ITN, one-time partner at Ofcom, now professor at City University, and government advisor Stuart Purvis. Your appreciation for the panel, please. Thank you very much. Well, just to get us started, before we talk about George, perhaps we could talk about Mark. He's done an interview with Broadcast Magazine, some of you may have seen it, in which he talks about his legacy. Greg, how would you assess Mark Thompson's legacy?
I think he's done pretty well. Is that enough?
No.
Oh. No, I think he's done a good job.
Better than the bloke before, obviously. But.
Well, only you can say that. No, seriously, I think he's done a good job as Director General. I think on the big things, he's by and large been right.
He lays claim in the broadcast article almost to sort of to the iPlayer. I mean, he's been hired by the New York Times as a kind of someone who understands the world of digital. How would you assess that claim?
Well, the iPlayer had been around before Mark. It was, in fact, the reason it took so long to get it on was because of the wonderful public interest test that delayed it for about 2 years. I first knew about the iPlayer from Ashley Highfield, who was in charge of all new media, and he came to me with the idea. But Mark implemented it, got it there, and it's been a big success.
And how would you say the BBC now sits as George takes over? How would you assess its position? Under threat, riding high? What's the problem? What would you say?
I think this is a great moment for the BBC. I think this is, you know, if you actually look at it, I think the Olympics summed up what the BBC is about. And I think the strongest opponents of the BBC, which are by and large the Murdochs, the Daily Mail and the rest of it, are all damaged goods. And I think there's a wonderful opportunity for the BBC to restate what it's about over the next few years.
Lorraine, how do you see Mark's legacy? Where do you think it stands?
I agree with Greg. I think Mark's done a good job. He took over when the organisation was in a state of shock, really, post-Hutton, post-Greg's abrupt departure. And it was quite a challenge to steady the ship and to, I suppose, get the BBC back on an even keel in every respect, you know, politically, socially, and for the staff. I think one of the things he kind of failed to do was to put his arms around the staff. And there's still a lot of nervousness, I feel, amongst members of the staff who feel, you know, especially because we had Queensgate and various other scandals or editorial scandals during Mark's time, that there's a fear that you lose your job if you put a foot wrong. And for a creative organisation, I think that's very damaging. You know, he did secure a licence fee settlement, albeit very abruptly, but he, you know, was kind of bulldozed into it. I think he probably got the best that he could under the circumstances. And he has backed the walk, which I think has been great creatively for the BBC and also helped the independent sector. Plus, you know, there's been the move to Salford and a real attempt to decentralise what has been a very southern-based, London-based metropolitan organisation.
Andy, do you, on that point, you spent a long time at Granada, working in the north of England and so on. Do you see the BBC changing its spots in terms of its metro excuse me, metrocentricity?
Well, I do think it's a very good thing that the BBC is in Manchester generally, and it should be in the regions. It needs to be. The very best of our television and the best of our writers have frequently come from the regions. And I think the BBC has a big need to do that. Whether it needs quite such big offices and whether it needs to have so many people shunting up and down on trains, I don't know. That seems a bit mad and a bit excessive and rather a waste of money. But in principle, the idea is a good one. Although I think there should be more power, more channels or more living creative organism inside something like Salford.
Now, Stuart, Mark Thompson talks in his broadcast piece about the BBC being right on the edge in some departments. In other words, because of DQF, the cuts programme, delivering quality first, living with the licence fee, a 20% cut in real terms and so on. So he's already talking about some departments being right on the edge, talking about George Entwistle having to kind of watch quality like a hawk, meaning I think that it's kind of quite near to the edge. Yeah. Is it your estimation in government circles, is that how it's seen? Is the BBC seen as being right on the edge? No more efficiencies, please, or we've had it.
Well, I think in government circles, funny enough, the focus is on the money that taxpayers used to, the things that taxpayers used to pay for, but now the licence fee payer pays for. They are still very focused on making those things actually happen. So they're very grateful that they've almost raided the licence fee very successfully, that the BBC has been top sliced. No one ever dares use that word, but that's effectively what's happened. And so the mechanics of that are playing out. So to the point about his legacy, I think on the licence fee settlement, we don't actually know. Because first of all, we don't still know whether the numbers quite add up. And certainly I can understand why people in some departments are nervous of how exactly it's going to work. But more importantly, I think, has a precedent been set about moving money from, if you like, moving the funder from the taxpayer to the licence, that the BBC will come to regret licence fee settlement after licence fee settlement. That's assuming there are more licence fee settlements.
Do you think Mark Thompson will end up being remembered for that? Because if I recall, he did, we'll talk about this later, I guess, when we talk about the next licence fee settlement, but he did agree, didn't he? He was the one who agreed the settlement, which included money for digital switchover.
Yeah, let me give you an example. Who in the room has ever heard of BD UK? Right. BD UK is a government unit inside DCMS which is spending £300 million of licence fee payers' money on broadband development. And in return, the BBC gets one seat on the board of something called the Broadband Portfolio. Now, if I were in government coming to the next licence fee settlement, I'd say that's a pretty interesting precedent that I might try again.
Okay.
I think also in that licence fee settlement, the unbuckling of licence fee and inflation is a problem for the BBC. Because, you know, who knows, if inflation runs at 5% a year for the next 5 years, it's a very big cut. But also, it's the first time ever it's been unbuckled in the last 20, 30 years. And once you unbuckle it, will they ever put it back together again? I mean, money is going to be a problem for the BBC, there's no doubt about that.
Okay, well, on the subject of which, Lorraine, I say Mark has talked about departments being near the edge. It talks in terms of, you know, we're at the point where any more requirements to cut and things will simply stop happening. Now, George Entwistle, is there any wriggle room for George anywhere that you can see in the BBC generally that might give him some relief from what looks like a pretty hard slog to get 20% out?
Well, first of all, I think Mark's right. I think programmes are on the edge. I think producers have faced systematic cuts now, year on year on year on year, for a good 5 years. And there's only so much you can take out of the budget of a returning series before it starts to impact on screen. So that squaring the circle of quality versus cuts is going to be increasingly difficult. I think George has got to look at simplifying the organisation. I think he's got to look at cutting the overhead, and one way of doing that is to reduce in-house production, not to do away with it, but the independent sector has proven itself more than capable of producing high-quality public service programming for very cost-effectively. As soon as you have in-house, you have to have a number of overheads that go with it, so I'd definitely be looking at changing that. And overall simplifying, because now there is Salford, now there are various other initiatives. The sort of stratosphere tends to multiply, and you've got all these people whose jobs run into each other, cut across each other. And I know George is aware of that. He was starting to simplify it at Vision, but across the BBC.
Greg, do you think the BBC is as efficient as it could be?
No, I don't think No organisation is as efficient as it could be. You can always make further cuts. You can always change things, always, in any organisation.
Well, let's put the question a different way then. Are there aspects of what the BBC does that are significantly inefficient still?
I don't know, because I haven't been there for 7 years. But I suspect there are, as there are in most organisations. The problem is you can only keep cutting overhead for so long. It's too demoralising to an organisation. I suspect in all organisations, the moment you stop cutting overhead, it starts going back on again. So every so often, you've got to do it again.
What about Lorraine's argument that in-house production is
Yeah, I love people who were in-house producers and loved every moment of it. As soon as they become independent, suddenly they think this is the great way forward. That's always popular here.
But time has moved on.
It's always a popular line here. What do I think? I think the ownership of rights becomes more and more important. And therefore, I think the BBC gets out of in-house production at its peril. And I always did, for that reason, for the ownership of rights.
Andy, are you, as a producer, are you ever tempted, or do you meet people who are tempted to go and work inside the BBC?
I think that's one of the biggest problems of the maintenance of in-house production is that, I mean, the level of the pressure on the cuts and I think morale is low inside in-house production, and it's low for many, many reasons. That's not to say there are not many great people working inside in-house production. There are, but in-house production producers can only work for the BBC, and this, in this day and age, does seem a very strange anomaly. There must be a way of rethinking BBC production so that it could work for other companies, or there's a way of maybe moving it into BBC Worldwide, or just rethinking the whole thing. It does seem very, very odd. It's born of an old era when it was just really ITV and BBC, and both had in-house producers.
It's being said in some places that one of the things that George, sort of offered as part of his pitch for the job was a reinvention of in-house production. There's a sense in which, as you say, it's not necessarily the most creative place. It's beset with its own difficulties. You can only work for the BBC, which, if you're a producer obsessed with an idea, can be pretty depressing. Once one committee has said no, that's the kind of end of the game. Lorraine, have you got any? If you were charged with reinventing in-house production, what would you do?
I mean, in the end, it is all about creativity, having probably, in some instances, fewer people, but really, really good people following their passions and giving them the latitude to develop ideas and to pitch those ideas. I think what's happened is that the confidence has been knocked out of in-house. I think in some areas, and I would say entertainment is one, they've been weak for a long time. I mean, interestingly, comedy in-house is having an upsurge, so these things are always cyclical. And then there are some areas, specialist factor, where the BBC has, a monopoly, is extremely successful at doing it and is prepared to make the long-term investment. But it's very frustrating, and in the early 90s when I was a producer in science, really frustrating that when you have a great idea, you can't take it elsewhere. And therefore, the independent sector becomes increasingly an attractive place for creative people to work.
So in terms of the way the organisation functions, is there anything George could specifically do you think, to begin to reinvigorate it?
Yeah, you could change the commissioning system.
Go on.
In the old days of ITV, in the old days of the BBC, if you ran the entertainment department, you could make a decision about getting something on. You can't do that anymore. And I think it's a convoluted, difficult commissioning system. I think the whole of British television took on the Channel 4 model, and I don't think it was necessarily in its interests. But you could change the commissioning system so you give more power to the people who are actually producers.
So you would devolve...
I would do it both independently and and in-house. And if they don't deliver, then don't give them another one.
So you devolve creative decision by commissioning decisions, or some of them, to production departments and producers.
Yeah, I mean, this whole mass of commissioners that has emerged in the last 15 years in all broadcasters, but particularly at the BBC, I think is quite damaging to it. I wish I'd changed it when I was there.
You brought it in.
No, I didn't. John no such luck. John Burr brought it. I got rid of it in some areas, like children's and things like that. We got rid of it. I wish I'd done more.
But the vision, as I recall it, though, was that the genres would be curated, if you like, looked after by more powerful genre commissioning editors. The channels would become probably less significant over time. You introduced the double tick, didn't you?
We introduced double tick, but but that's commissioners versus channel controllers.
Yes.
I'm looking at the other way around. I'm talking about commissioners vis-a-vis the production departments.
And
when Bill Cotton ran entertainment at the BBC, he would walk in and say, I've got a good one for you guys, and they'd all sit and wait for it, and it would come. Now, I'm not saying you can go back to that, but somehow you've lost that ability. What's the point of going to the BBC if you've just got to sell along with everybody else, and you haven't got any real power yourselves in a production department? You know, you look back at the old ITV that Andy was part of and I was part of, 5 different people could say yes to a drama, and they were head of the drama department, and they were then responsible for delivering it. Well, actually, ITV's drama then was significantly better than it is now.
If you've got a position where you've got the window of creative competition, you know, 25% of the output, nearly 85% of the available WOC was won by indies. Now the writing must surely be on the wall for an in-house production department that loses 85% of the contestable.
Well, I think what's changed in British television, if you look back to Strictly, I mean, who invented Strictly is always one of those great discussions, who invented a great show. But
It was Fenrir and Jane.
who got given a bonus of £5,000, right? Fenrir got given a bonus of £5,000. If she'd invented Strictly in an independent, and she'd owned the independent, she would have made many millions. And I think in those circumstances, I'm probably fighting a forlorn battle.
Andy, how do you think, what could George do to make the BBC a more interesting place for talent?
Well, I suppose, make it more interesting place for talent. I think the talent will be better looked after by independence, in truth. I think the BBC gets itself into a terrible problem with trying to deal with talent. If someone like Jonathan Ross, or indeed any talent, is essentially fundamentally controlled and paid and used by a production company which is selling into the BBC, it removes the BBC management with this significant problem about how much they're paying them and what have you. They don't have to get into this negotiations. The BBC seems to be gets over-entangled with these sort of problems.
Stuart, does this question about in-house production have any kind of resonance in the world outside of that occupied by people like us? I mean, for example, the broadcasters all now produce reports commissioned from Deloitte, or forgive me, Deloitte, sorry, KPMG, whoever, about their economic impact and the value they offer to society and all the rest of it, multiplier effects, all the rest of it.
Sky most recently.
Sky most recently, but they all do it.
Yeah.
How does the question of in-house versus independent production figure in that argument, or does it?
Well,
Creative Britain and all that.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that Sky bothered to do that because I don't think they would have done a few years ago. They were, things there's almost 2 fingers to the establishment. So they are trying to send a message, which obviously doing through their commissioning process as well, that they are about investment in UK talent. So it seems to me it's a kind of service message, it's a political message. I mean, when I was at Ofcom dealing with the rules about independence, I mean, it was always intriguing, particularly ITV always trying to push down quotas. But actually, when you looked at what they commissioned, the quota really wasn't an issue. So I sometimes wonder, whether, everyone would like to see quotas removed in some ways, unless they're independents. But by and large, people have worked their way through these perfectly well. But as you say, the real issue is that 50% that the Indies can't get anywhere near. And I think that goes to a point that I think that you made in the column, is how does this connect to the worldwide finances? What's the connection? Because if you reduce it in-house and you're effectively giving away rights crudely, how do you then expect to grow the finances of worldwide? Because you've got less stuff to sell. And that's where I'm not sure how this adds up.
Andy, you've had direct experience of worldwide. They invested in your company.
Yes.
What do you make of them?
Well, this is an interesting example of how commercial the BBC can be. When we set up Left Bank Pictures 5 years ago, the BBC invested £1 million in our company. ITV had turned us down flat, and we sold the company this week for a rumoured sum, quite high. The BBC has made something like 10 times its investment back in just 5 years, plus all the money it's been making on our shows. Worldwide has been a tremendous success. John Smith's done a marvellous job in boosting the profits and really building the organisation up, and yet in the last 18 months you're seeing it having to start to pare back. The management starting to change. You feel the pressure on the company.
Well, clearly there's something going on. Still don't we quite know what's going, because Lord Patten has been uneasy about worldwide. If you go back, when Mark Thompson, for instance, was at Channel 4, he effectively brought back the kind of Channel 4 version of worldwide and sort of made it closer to the mainstream programming. So I'm just intrigued as to what actually is in the mind of the trust and the management about what they really want to do with Worldwide. Is it just a question that they want to change the management, or do they want to change the model somehow?
Greg, how much value does Worldwide really deliver? I mean, if you look at the numbers...
Well, you've got to... It delivers quite a lot of money, but you've got to look at it relative to how much the BBC gets. If you get £3.5 billion a year, someone who provides you with 150 million a year is important, but it's not a lot compared to £3.5 billion.
Although at a time when everything else, when you're looking at 20% more, 20% less, it might be more important.
Yeah, and you look all the time for additional money in those circumstances. But I mean, these cuts could be, if inflation roars away, these cuts could be really significant.
On the BBC, you mean?
Yeah.
Do you think BBC Worldwide is in a difficult position? I mean, it was again rumoured that the big investment for BBC Worldwide at the BBC Showcase this year was Sinbad, which is a Sky One programme. It's a perfectly straightforward commercial investment, no doubt. The BBC Worldwide would do very well out of it. The chairman was reportedly not best chuffed and wondering why BBC Worldwide was investing in a programme that was not the BBC's. Does BBC Worldwide offer any difficulties to George, do you think?
I think it goes through this it's like everything at the BBC, it's all cyclical. And I think the BBC Worldwide goes through times when I remember, the 2000 licence fee settlement, the government of the day told the BBC to increase its external income by selling loads more. When it did that, it got attacked by other people, and that's the way the BBC lives. I mean, we shouldn't feel sorry for it. I mean, the BBC is an incredibly successful organisation that will continue. But all these things, it is the old, do you invest in programmes that not many people watch but are wonderful, or do you invest in things that get big audiences and get attacked? I mean, it's the problem the BBC always faces.
You've said that the money's going to be difficult, and 20% less for 20% less for 20% more, or 20% more for 20% less is plainly very challenging, the licence fee settlement and so on. This is conventionally...
Where did the 20% more come from?
Well, because people keep talking about having to deliver, because they've got new services, so on and so on, need more, prices go up. There's quite a lot to do with quite a lot less.
Now, I think that there's a very real chance at the end of 5 years it's going to be 20 to 30% less. I agree with that.
Right, so that's going to be quite serious. Now, that's generally presented as salami slicing, which people appear to have turned their
Well, as I understand the agreement they did with the government, they're not allowed to close any services.
The government don't expect them to, that's correct.
Well, because Jeremy Hunt realised that if you close a service, I mean, you saw it with various radio stations, if you close a service, the people who love that give the politicians a very hard time.
If you're looking for 20 or 30% over 5 years, that's a fifth to a third.
Well, I think one of the...
Where do you go?
I think one of the discussions, one of the campaigns that needs to go on in what I think over the next period is actually, politically, it could change, life could change again. And actually, I think the BBC should be prepared to make an argument saying the cuts are too great for this organisation for what it delivers to the public.
So an increase in the licence fee?
Well, I think it needs more friends out there fighting for it and saying, as long as it's as efficient as it can be, saying, look, the BBC needs more than this. Now, you might say, well, this isn't possible, but go back to when Labour first got elected in '97. That's precisely what happened. That the cuts that had been proposed by the previous Conservative government were abandoned, and a licence fee increase of 1.5%.
Notwithstanding what the government expect, because those were negotiations behind closed doors, and no one will kind of quite admit precisely what was said. If you were looking for 20 to 30%, would you consider cutting services, or would you look for kind of efficiencies? Do you think, or are there pockets of inefficiency? Do you expect an organisation that which could be tackled? I mean,
well, we've kind of been around the circle on this a number of times, haven't we? And the fact is, we don't understandably have complete transparency about the numbers. So, how much did the BBC spend on the Olympics? I mean, everyone says it was fantastic, but we don't actually know what the number is, so we can't tell you whether that was money could have been better spent in other places. I mean, look at it a different way, Steve. I mean, we always talk, certainly those of us with a background in commercial television, about, well, the BBC set the standards, and therefore we kind of assume that the BBC is best. I mean, is the BBC News Channel better than Sky News? No, I don't think it is. Is the BBC World News Channel better than Al Jazeera English? No, I don't think it is. Was the BBC's coverage of the cycling road race better than ITV's coverage of the Tour de France? No, I don't think it was. So there are a whole series of things where actually judged on the screen, the BBC isn't
Do
necessarily
you mean the Olympic
better.
road race?
Yeah, I mean,
I
if you take the Olympic road race...
In fairness to that wasn't the BBC.
That wasn't their coverage.
No, yeah,
That
but
was the Olympic...
yeah, it was, but I mean,
And they used the mobile phones for...
In fairness, nor was ITV's coverage of the Tour de France, because it was actually France Television's pictures. But what I'm saying is that the production values that ITV brought to the Tour de France, I personally, as a viewer, thought were better than the production values that the BBC brought to road race cycling. I'm just giving you an example.
So in terms of George's options, then, where does that get you?
Well, that gets you. I have always thought that actually you have to keep returning to the talent costs, and in some ways to the sports rights costs, because they are big sums of money, they're big pots. So I understand why, for instance, they've had to let go of certain Formula One rights. I understand why they've had to let go of certain horse racing rights. But since these numbers are not in the public domain, I can't give you a scientific formula of how you would better spend that money.
Okay, we'll open it up to the audience briefly if anyone has a contribution or a comment or a question. I can't see the audience at the moment, but I'm sure we'll... there we go. So on this question of then efficiency, DQF, 20% cuts and whatever, any thoughts or contributions, questions to the panel? Don't hold back. Well, obviously you can if you like. Do show. I can't see.
I think there's a danger that the discussion...
over there. Sorry, go on.
I was just going to say, I think there's a danger that the discussion's going as if we don't want the BBC to survive. We do want the BBC to be incredibly successful. We do want it to be spending the majority of its money on services and programming. And actually, I thought the Olympic coverage was amazing. Yeah. It was really first class. And having watched some of it in the States and some of it in France, I can tell you the BBC coverage was pretty good. Whether ITV's or somebody else's would have been as good is not the point. The point is the BBC did it brilliantly, and it is funded to be able to cover those kinds of events.
We'll come back to the Olympics.
Sorry, all the point I make, I'm not criticising the BBC's coverage. All I'm saying is that I don't accept that the BBC will always do things better because it is the BBC. And I think that where the BBC budgets have been cut very tight, and I quote those two news channels because they've had their budgets cut very tight, I don't think they're fully competitive with the outside market.
Okay. Well, BBC World was always a difficult...
Just one second before we get on with this. Who was there would like to speak?
I was sat in a
Do tell us who you are.
It's Toby Scolthorpe from Keogh Films. I sat in a session with Jeff Ford this morning from Channel 5. He cut the commissioners down to 6, I think, across the channel. Substantial cuts, more money made available by Richard Desmond, and a creep in audience share. So, does the panel think that George should be talking to Richard Desmond?
No, I don't think so. I think...
the point is, it seems to me it can be made.
The point is it's a very complex commissioning system with probably too many layers, and that the BBC imposes such a bureaucracy on these people so that they have to go to so many meetings and what have you, rather than just being able to concentrate on their jobs. So you have too many people in the chain who aren't empowered to make a decision, and you know, it's that thing of don't take a no from somebody who can't give you a yes. If you freed up everybody so that they didn't have to go to all these meetings and could focus on the job, because ITV also has a much less people, many fewer people in its commissioning system, and they're very efficient. So I think it has become incredibly complex.
But a much lower volume of commissioned material.
Yeah, but it's just become too layered. It really has.
So you sat there as controller of BBC One with commissioning editors looking after genres and whatever. Do you think the commissioning structure as it is could be significantly pared back?
I think it could. I think that the BBC places such a burden on its staff in terms of all these other things they have to do that aren't necessarily just to do with their job. And, you know, I can remember talking to different people. When you leave the BBC, it's suddenly like, oh, I can get my day job done in the day because I don't have to do all this other stuff, rather than having to take loads and loads of work home with me all the time. So it just loads initiatives, DQF, working parties, you know, this, that, and the other. There's always something else that you have to do. And I think simplifying that and freeing people up to do their jobs is really important, so then you wouldn't need so many.
Okay. Anybody else here?
That's Pat.
Down here. Okay, forgive me if I've missed you, I can't see properly.
Oh, thanks. Hello, I'm Mimi Turner. I'm the Group Director of Communications for Northern Shell. We own Channel 5. I can't actually see if Jeff Ford is in this room and might want to take this question in a different way, but I was curious to ask you, because, you know, at Channel 5, we do television in perhaps a way that the BBC might not consider doing television. We do it in a very focused way. We look at every individual programme, look at its share. We have an enormous ambition for the channel and for investing in a great big idea, if a great big idea is there. But we do it, I am sure, in a cost-based model that you might not recognise and you might not admire.
Okay, so Mimi, let me cut to the
yes.
chase, because we need to get a move
Yes.
on. What's the one thing that George Entwistle should learn from Richard Desmond, or should I say Channel 5?
I don't think that I'm well placed to give that advice, but I would
Thank
say
you very much.
there is a model, there is another model, and I think that television as a whole, channels as a whole, would do well to just look at another model.
Okay.
We have grown our audience share as the only family of channels of all the terrestrial channels.
Okay.
And you can not like it, but that's the facts.
We'll make sure that that is passed on to George, I'm sure.
I sought to give him no advice. I think channels as a whole, there's
Pat,
another model.
Do tell the people who you are, thanks.
Pat Young, I run in-house production at the BBC. I'm only going to make a couple of points because I imagine with Liz speaking it's going to be a long weekend. Point number one, creativity. I mean, yeah, do we have a morale issue? Of course we do. You know, when the public pay policy is market minus 25% and no bonuses, of course you have morale issues.
Is that why you think you've got one?
No. That said, we won 1/3 of all of the BAFTAs this year. 1/3 won by a group of people who can only pitch to 4 channels against an industry who can pitch anywhere and put any submission. So, yeah, we have our creative ups and downs, but creatively, I think fundamentally, we're still in a fairly good place. Second thing is, it's really interesting to hear the big 10 indies who account for about 75% of all of the business saying that the BBC should be freed from its guarantee and let them pitch everywhere else. Because what we would do, you know, we've got some pretty good programme makers, we would destroy a fleet of indies. Because who are Channel 4 going to come to for natural history? Who are Channel 4 going to come to for science? You know, who are ITV going to come to for natural history? Who are Sky going to come to for comedy? You know, we're going to win business from, maybe we won't win much business from the Big 10, but the rest of them will win a lot of business, enough to put them out of, you know, in their peril. Final point that I'd make is in a world where we all know we're moving to an IP on-demand world where the ownership of rights is crucial, why shouldn't the British public own at least 50% of the rights of the content that they pay for? You know, I think that's a very basic proposition that we can go out and win on. So, you know, the attack isn't unexpected. I don't think in-house is the big threat to the BBC. I think we've got our challenges. I'm glad it's George and not me that's got to deal with them. But we'll get through. But this fixation on in-house as the problem, there is no evidence that we're even more expensive. Okay. No evidence at all that you can point to.
Okay, so what's the one thing from where you sit that you would like to see George Entwistle do?
I want to see George put creativity back at the heart of the organisation.
What does that mean?
What that means is sometimes it feels that making programmes is an inconvenient obstacle to running the BBC. And what I want him to see is put the programme making back into the middle.
Okay, thank you very much. We'll come back to I hope he's got your juices going, because we'll come back for more comment a little bit later. But just moving, the big thing, a big thing on the horizon for George is the charter review and a licence fee renewal process, which is going to come up in the next 4 or 5 years. In terms of charter review, Stuart, where do you see the BBC sitting?
Well, starting from this Greg's starting point, that the BBC is in a good place. I mean, it's probably in as good a place as it's been, subject to all the conditions both Greg and I have wondered about how the licence fee settlement's going to work out financially. But in so many ways, it is in an excellent place. I think there are 2 themes. One is we're bound to have one of those things that goes on for years about who's BBC, what is the point of the BBC, consultations galore. We just simply have to kind of get used to that and get through that. I think of the issues I've been intrigued in, one is the one I mentioned earlier, which is top slicing, which is will the next government, and we don't know that it's going to be this government, it could be any flavour of government by the time we get around to this, are they going to come back for more? Because the public finances may or may not have improved in the way they want, and they're looking for savings from broadcasting. And secondly, and this is the longer term issue, which I think is intriguing, the House of Lords Committee on Communications published a report a few weeks ago. It had a section in it saying, we should know the implications of high-speed broadband going to 90%, potentially to 100% in terms of the use of spectrum. In other words, I think within the geeks of broadcasting, there's been a wonder about whether at some point broadcasting comes off spectrum and goes crudely onto the internet, onto other forms of distribution. The reason being that spectrum is worth a fortune, and it arguably could benefit the public in all sorts of ways about mobility and that sort of thing.
So do you think then that is the charter review process critical for the BBC or not?
I think it's critical in getting the framework right. It's critical as a way of getting the licence fee settlement right. But I wonder whether we're this far out from it where we can predict exactly what the technology implications of it are.
Great.
It should be the last thing he's worried about with 5 years to go. I mean, God, it's only lasts 7 years, usually, the charter. If you're going to start worrying about it with a year, it's only 2 years in, you're nuts. It's not what he should be worrying about. Because, as Stuart quite rightly says, you have no idea what the environment's going to be in 5 years' time. The technological change. If you just go back to the Charter Renewal in the mid-90s, I think, it never mentioned the internet. And yet by 2000, the BBC was leading the way. I mean, you just can't predict things in a 7-year charter renewal process. So what matters is what are the opportunities that come up over the next 5 years and what does the BBC do about them? And that's the really interesting thing. Grab the opportunities and go and don't get left behind. But I don't think you can sit here saying the charter renewal is a fairly bureaucratic process that happens every 7 years. This must be your 5th time you've chaired a session on charter renewal at your age. I mean,
5 is no. Not even I go about that far, yes.
Can I just mention one other technology-related point, though I'm not a technologist. There was an intriguing element of the BBC's Olympics coverage, which was their caution about any kind of cross-promotion to what Sky and Virgin Media were doing with their various channels. You will have noticed that they never said, if you now want to watch Taekwondo, go to channel X or channel Y. That's because they were trying to protect the position of Freeview, which didn't actually have such a wide offerings. And I think this issue of Freeview's future, particularly in this world I've talked about, why has the BBC, why has Mark Thompson put so much time and money into YouView, and kind of where is YouView? And we talked about iPlayer, we talked about Salford. YouView won't actually go down as one of his greatest hits. So I think there are a whole series of things that haven't fully played out yet about the BBC's position in platforms.
Do you think that the BBC will face antagonists in terms of other broadcast? Last time with Charter Review, if I recall, there was quite a lot of stuff about the BBC, BBC expansionism, parking its tanks on our lawn, commercial broadcasters under the cosh with the recession, looking at a BBC that was kind of richer and better financed and all the rest of it than they were. There was quite a lot of pressure on that. Yeah. That seems to have abated in part because the public value test system, bureaucratic as it is, appears to have taken the heat out of the argument. Yeah. Are they going to face serious antagonists?
Well, I think two things. First of all, I think some of the reforms that Lord Patten has put in around the public value test have kind of solved some of those particular problems were there. The other thing to say is, all honesty, because some of us here used to be the people who always used to complain about the BBC at charter renewal time, was actually a lot of us were fed up about how much money the BBC had compared to how much we had, because we were in the real world. Well, that's kind of gone away. So if there was a kind of grudge element to it, that's gone away. The process has been sorted out, so there will always be people complaining about the BBC, but I don't think they have such good grounds to complain about it.
Right. Well, also, remember that the leaders in that were other media organisations and newspaper groups, and they're damaged. They're damaged goods. Who's going to take any notice of them?
And you think you can predict that 5 years out?
Yeah. Yeah, yes. What's happened to News International is a massive turning point in the way the influence newspapers and newspaper groups have on our society. Yes.
Well, I'm sure we'll hear more about that later on this evening, but in this very room, in fact. Is there a case for the BBC considering other forms of funding? I'm thinking, if David Elstein was here, and I should apologise on his behalf, he's had an operation on his foot, and so reluctantly, unfortunately, couldn't be with us, although he's building the programme. If he was sitting here, I'm sure he'd be saying that with the technological capability of doing it now, the BBC should shift rapidly to a subscription system.
I still think the licence fee is the best way of funding the BBC. It's the most practical, it's the most cost effective. I think the difficulty is the switch away from potentially people viewing on TVs and therefore it being called a TV license fee, and people viewing on other platforms, so whether it's your iPad, your laptop, whatever it might be. And somehow you need to keep those people in the fold, so it has to be rebranded, I guess. And
but isn't there a case, though, that the licence fee is just increasing? It looks, and to take Greg's point, maybe it's just too small. In other words, it's not enough. But the expectations that the BBC generates, I mean, so take the Olympics coverage, 24 channels, HD, in partnership with Sky, has to be said, nevertheless, extraordinary range of coverage. I don't know a commercial broadcaster that could have attempted anything like that, because for them, it's all cost, no revenue.
Imagine, I mean, the real thing about the BBC is about universality, is that everybody can receive it. The moment you take that away with subscription, you change it forever, and you change something that's, I think, essential in our society forever. If you look at the Olympics, imagine the Olympics on Sky, where it would have been available only in 50% of homes, and if you actually look at Sky's figures, it would probably have only a quarter, half the people in those homes would have actually watched it. That would have been a disaster, I think, compared to what we got. It was one of those great moments which brought a nation together, and that's what the BBC is.
I can see that. I was trying to get a slightly different argument, a slightly different point, which is that the licence fee is limited. It's only what it is, 145. It's now frozen. It's going to have been frozen for 7 or 8 years by the time we get to renewal.
Could you fund it in a different way? Yes.
Well, the point is, does the BBC need more than the licence fee can now realistically supply? Because every time it breaks the creative bank, like the Olympics, does an absolutely brilliant and spectacular job. It costs a fortune. It raises expectations, and next time round, you kind of have to match it. And you can't, right across the board, the better the BBC does, the more it's going to cost. Yeah. Is the licence fee, I mean, John Burt realised this a long, long time ago, thought that the Achilles heel was that the licence fee couldn't rise fast enough to keep up with rising consumer expectations, which the BBC generates all the time, especially when it's doing things well.
And so that's the problem. They launch a new service, and then if they try and cancel the service, even if it doesn't have a large listenership or viewership, there's a massive complaints, and so they don't cancel it. And part of the problem is they're never allowed to make the tough decisions that they sometimes need to make. I mean, I still think they are going to have to commercialise some things and stop trying to do everything for free. I think it's a mistake to be circumscribing worldwide from the BBC's point of view, because they need any income that they can get. And it's very difficult for an organisation like Worldwide to be a little bit pregnant and to half be commercial and half not.
But aside from what Worldwide does in terms of secondary rights and whatever, can you see anything else the BBC could commercialise?
Well, I think they could start charging for the iPlayer.
Domestic iPlayer?
Yeah. Certainly after the 7-day window. So people are more than happy to pay for DVDs. They're more than happy to go on iTunes and pay for...
BBC Archive as well should be available.
The original plan for the iPlayer was a 7-day window. Although I had this discussion with someone the other day because someone asked me why was it a 7-day window, and I couldn't remember, and nor could the other person who invented it. So we don't quite know why there was a 7-day window, but there's a 7-day window.
Channel 4 started out with 30 days.
There was a 7-day window, and after that, the idea was that anybody who still wanted to get that would pay for it. And that you switch from one to the other, and that's never really happened, and that's possible. But even that is a source of income, but it's not a massive source of income. The dividend, I think Stuart's got the point, the dividend is going to be the present legislation says you pay a licence fee for television receiving equipment. What happens when everybody can receive it only on the computer?
Strictly speaking, it doesn't say that, but no.
Well, it does. It doesn't include a laptop.
It does. You pay a licence to receive TV pictures as broadcast on any device. What you don't do is pay a licence to receive content on demand. So if all you do is watch on demand, you don't have to pay a licence, even if it's on a 70-inch TV. If you watch TV as broadcast, you have to pay a licence even if it's on the back of a matchbox. In actual, as it happens, but the point is real enough. Andy, do you have any problem with the BBC charging for things?
I think the iPlayer is an area of real possibility. And again, it has caused problems for independence. It does, in the long term, these revenues are going to be lost. I think it's a way the BBC should. I think the BBC should think about it quite seriously. Yes.
What about subscription for BBC services? What would your attitude to that be?
I think that's tricky. I think, you know, the BBC is a very wonderful thing. We all love what the BBC provides. There are no other country in the world that has what the BBC has, what we have enjoyed. And I agree with Greg that culturally, the impact of the Olympics, the impact on the nation is a direct result of the BBC. We lose that. We lose something very special in our country.
Do you think, there's been a lot of talk, we may get more of this tonight again, but Sky investing more in original content.
Yes.
Leave aside for how much it is, but they were always attacked for not investing in original content. Then they started investing in original content. People say, whoops, careful, Sky's taking all the talent. Now, I think you've done stuff for Sky and whatever. Yeah. First of all, what are they like to work for? Secondly, and how do they compare to the BBC? And what should George worry about that or do anything in response to that?
Well, Sky's great news for the production community because they're pumping money in. We're making shows for them. What are they like compared to the BBC? Well, they initially were very flexible and very speedy because they were smaller. Now they're bigger. They're producing a lot more stuff. Many of their executives are straight from the BBC, so they're becoming quite similar. But what is interesting is that if you look, for example, there's a tiny little example of how the BBC reacted, I think, in a very clever way. When Sky hoovered up all the American shows, when they bought out AMC and HBO and Showtime, the likes of BBC4 simply had no American shows they could play. So they went into the world market and started buying up shows from Denmark and France and Italy, which was something that had never been screened. They had none of these excellent shows, some of them, not all great, of course, but many of them are, and they provided a wonderful new Saturday evening viewing for many, many people. Not only bringing stuff that we hadn't seen before, although it's similar to UK stuff, but also, I think, in reminding us as drama producers that perhaps some of our stuff wasn't quite as good as some of the stuff we were watching.
So Sky provoked the BBC into doing something that was rather good.
Exactly, and I think that Sky moving in on talent now in quite a big way should force the BBC, or elements of the BBC, to look for newer talent, younger talent, different ways. You've got a blue sky. Competition like this has to be good. It's got to be good for the BBC to be pushed hard on it. That's what the BBC needs. It needs to be pushed hard all the time, and it'll get better.
We should all welcome Sky spending more money on original British production. I mean, good on them. I hope they spend more. I mean, it interested me for years that they didn't, and they didn't because why did we not get an HBO in this country? And we didn't because actually most of the money that came through, the new money that came to pay television, actually went to footballers, right? And that's what happened. It went on sports rights for the first decade or so. Now that's changing, and I think we should just welcome that. Look, it's a lot more work, it's a lot more product, it's a lot more things for people to watch.
Just one more question for all of you, then we'll ask the audience back in again. But last time the licence fee was looked at, Lord Burns was set up with a committee. He's now obviously the chairman of Channel 4, and that committee came to the conclusion that the licence fee would be best spent if it were open to other people, other organisations doing public broadcasting to apply to use it. And if I recall, their recommendation was that what became the BBC Trust should be a public service broadcasting trust to which the BBC should apply for its cash. In other words, but the argument was that without licence fee support, public broadcasting purposes elsewhere would simply wither. Now, Channel 4 have since stopped asking for cash, which they were back then, but nevertheless, is that an argument, Stuart, that you think has gone dead and buried, or is George going to have to face something similar?
Well, I mean, I think that it's not quite what Lord Burns had in mind, but the status quo that we've arrived at has got elements of that. I mean, if you look at, BBC World Service Radio, well, it was always made by the BBC, it just money came from elsewhere. Put that one aside. You've got money going into broadband, which is, arguing for the public good. You've got BBC money going into local TV. Now, I find that an interesting scenario. I think, frankly, behind the scenes, there's been quite a lot of tension about that money, but that's going into non-BBC content. Admittedly, the BBC can have access to it. So if we've crossed a line...
And S4C, of course.
And S4C, of course, which under the deal between the BBC and S4C, quite rightly, because I was an advisor to S4C on the deal, they've actually got a fair amount of independence despite the funding. So you've already created this kind of body which oversees the distribution of licence fee in a number of different ways. I have to say, some of us will remember the BBC's fight against any money from, actually not from the core licence fee, but from the from the help scheme going to regional news. Actually, some of it's somebody now ended up in local news for local television. So once you've crossed that point, the question really, though, is are you going to open up to what we, certainly when I was at Ofcom, we called contestable funding? Can producers go and say, this programme isn't actually for the BBC, but it is for the public good, it's for a certain channel, and could such a body as the Trust distribute that money? That's the bigger issue.
And?
I personally never saw it was such a big problem because I looked at the model in Ireland, which works perfectly well. I've looked at models in Singapore. And frankly, if we've crossed the line, because BBC money is going into local TV, or license fee money is going to local TV, why can't it go into other worthwhile productions if that's what local TV is?
Lorraine, is that a line that should have been crossed? Is it a worry to you? Should George be concerned about it?
I'd be concerned about it if I were George, and I would be trying to protect the status quo. As Stuart said, there have been various inroads, there's various protection mechanisms within it. Those inroads have all meant that the BBC has lost cash in real terms. And, you know, we're talking now about the difficulty of sustaining the services at the quality and level that we'd all like to see them sustained. And once they start nibbling away further, I think it would be a disaster. And then you're going to have some other bureaucracy, some kind of, what was it called, Arts Council of the Air or whatever, who's trying to commission these programmes to go out on which platforms and which channels. I don't know, I think it's all a bit complicated.
I know it's difficult to do these things with hindsight, but when Mark agreed to let the government to accept as part of the licence fee settlement he did after when he is part of the last one, as it were, well, not the last, but one.
I personally don't think they should have done that deal that night. I mean, it was done in about 4 days. It was a ridiculous way of doing the whole thing, enforced by the government. And what the government was trying to do, exactly what Stuart said, what the government was trying to do was to get anything that was being funded out of the exchequer to be plunged into the licence fee. And then, you know, I mean, the chairman of the BBC, the board of the BBC, and Mark almost all resigned over whether or not they would take on paying for the licence fees for the over 75s.
But the question is this going to be a problem for the next Director General? Is George going to have to worry about this?
No, because I don't think this government will be there. And I think the thing about new governments...
But the last lot want to get their hands on it for his local TVs, doesn't they?
Yeah, you know, Jeremy Hunt wanted to get some money for local TV because it was his pet project.
The Glade lot. Ben, they were after lots for independently financed news consortia, remember, was going to be.
They all go through cycles. We're just coming into the cycle where the government, becoming unpopular, is now blaming the BBC. Right, which is what all governments do after 2 or 3 years. They start blaming the BBC. And then eventually they lose the election and another lot come in who quite like the BBC when they come in, and then they've been in government for a while, and then everything they're unpopular about they blame on the BBC. And you're just beginning to see the transition now with this government. You just ignore it.
Whoever thought we'd hear a minister saying that the BBC had peed on somebody? I mean, what an extraordinary...
I know.
I missed it.
Yeah, Duncan Smith.
I mean, the real things come down to, I think there's got to be a campaign outside that says, look, the BBC is of enormous value to our society. If you go around the world, as Director General, you cannot believe how many people say the BBC is the most wonderful organisation. And only in Britain could we sit and have this sort of discussion about whether or not it should continue, whether or not how it's funded. I mean, it's agonising and in the end boring. I'm sorry about that, but it is. The real thing is we should think of other ways of funding the BBC as well as the licence fee. We should make sure the BBC is properly funded. And we should say, let's celebrate what we've got.
Okay. Who would like to contribute? Let's see what people have to say. Do wave. Chap there. Do tell us who you are, thanks.
Hi, I'm Justin Eade from Glimpse Films. I worked for the BBC for a number of years actually in Greg Dyke's period. And what just literally sprung to mind at that moment was really about what it is. I mean, I totally agree with what Greg was saying about it being, you know, invaluable to our society. But I wonder whether, in terms of how it connects more with the real issues of the day, whether that is sort of seen, the value of that is seen. So whether it's sort of climate change or health or the other sort of really pressing sort of problems in our world, and whether there's a sort of a value in that that's appreciated, and then what the BBC does to communicate is effectively appreciated more because it's actually more to do with, you know, the pressing needs of the world, that sort of thing.
Okay. Who else would like to contribute? Do show. Chap over there. And then someone at the back there. One over there and one at the back there, I think. Go on over there first then, yep. Do tell us who you are.
Thanks, Steve. John McVeigh from PACT. This is quite unusual, but actually I agree with Greg. I think we should be lining ourselves up for making sure that the next charter settlement is something that protects the BBC. I don't agree with Stuart's contestable funding. If you look at Canada, Telefilm in Canada went through that for many years and ended up giving the money to CBC to commission directly rather than producers going to get grants from a state agency. So I actually agree with Greg. I think we should be lining up to defend the licence fee and stop the cuts and stop the licence fee being used for government policy by proxy.
Okay, down here, number 3.
Hello there, hi, it's Phil Muse from Hammerhead TV. In 2014, there's a plan for a referendum on Scottish independence. If Scotland does become independent of the rest of the UK, what impact do you think that would have on the BBC?
Stuart.
Well, it's in some ways it's not the BBC any longer, is it? I mean,
we can't have one of the Bs. Yeah.
It's the EW and I BC, and what are the implications of that? I mean, I think the SNP has already begun to kind of soften its position on some of these kind of federal issues in terms of whether there are deals to be done around the British Army and things like that.
Concerned, I think, that if EastEnders were to be cut off,
then
the entire independence movement might go down.
You can see in a referendum that there's a very good scare story to be run here about a whole series of much-loved institutions. But I remember the debate going back many years ago to the Scotland at 6 and how your old friend at the BBC, formerly at LWT, fought very, very hard to stop it.
Who?
What was his name? John Burt.
No, the chairman. Christopher Bland.
Christopher Bland and John Burt didn't want the Scottish 6.
They did?
Didn't.
Right.
No, they were vehemently against it. Yeah. Personally, I didn't see a great problem with it.
Do you see...
Christopher Bland actually said to me, you at ITN are not going to let us down on the Scotland at 6, are you? He was kind of as basic as that about it.
What do you think?
I think even if Scotland doesn't vote for independence, which I doubt it will, but it will vote for a different sort of devolution. And I think at some stage, some broadcasting policy is going to have to go with that. Now, that doesn't mean to say the BBC can't broadcast it, but I do think at some stage, some broadcasting... that was one of the big battles of the last time around, was the government's attempt to hang on, during the devolution process, to hang on to broadcasting at the centre. And I don't think long term that will sustain, but it doesn't mean to say you won't have national channels. But I think some broadcasting policy will have to go down to the nations.
Well, and Alex Salmond is speaking in this very building tomorrow afternoon, I think about 4:30, so perhaps we'll hear what they have to say on that, but thank you for that. Any other points, any other questions, contributions? Do show.
There was a question earlier about, which I thought was quite interesting, which was about, does the BBC, or does television these days cover the big issues of our society that are not... I mean, when I first came into television, there was a battle between Stuart's lot, who were the news lot, and those of us who worked in current affairs. Well, the current affairs guys lost overwhelmingly because, and therefore the world was taken over by 24-hour news and news and the rest of it. There is an argument for that actually that there needs to be more analysis than you get from a 24 news environment. And that does mean you take on some of those subjects in a more thoughtful and profound way.
Okay, well, we've come to the end of our time, but let me ask you one more question, if I may. Various people, you're on the panel, and you've no doubt all had kind of banana skin moments. Lorraine, forgive me, I remember appearing in Twinset and Pearls to apologise for Richard Bacon's extracurricular nasal activities. Greg, as we know, departed the BBC in a sort of catastrophic moment of, well, catastrophe. So if everybody in these jobs is going to get blown off course, what do you think George is the worst nightmare that George has yet to have might be? Greg.
If you knew the worst nightmare, it wouldn't happen. The truth about the job, I remember John Burt explaining to me when I first got there, was the truth about the job is you can sit there having a perfectly okay week when something happens somewhere that you've never heard of and blows you apart. Right? And that's the hardest thing. Therefore, it's how do you deal with that? I mean, if I go back to Hutton, of course, if Dr. Kelly hadn't killed himself, Hutton would have been no Hutton, but there would have been a big issue of Alistair Campbell attacking the BBC, and then it would have gone away, because all news goes away in the end. But actually, Dr. Kelly killed himself, and that changed the whole game. you can't predict those things, so all you can do is try to be ready for them and be prepared for them.
Andy, you're a dramatist of considerable reputation. What's the worst nightmare you could invent for George?
Jesus, that's very. I don't know. It's a very hard question to answer. Actually, I've never worked at the BBC, so I can't imagine just how difficult it is as an institution. I think we've got to tackle that civil service mentality. Why does the government want the people inside the BBC to think they're civil servants? I think for creatives, that's a terrible, terrible thing. That's what I would try and get George to try and reinvigorate the creative community inside the BBC to stop them being told that they're just civil servants, because they're not, they're creators. And I go along with Pat, I understand what Pat's saying, and you don't want the morale of in-house production, if it's to continue, and it probably will, to be down. You want them to be out there. You want the BBC to have fun, to enjoy themselves. We want a great BBC. We want an accessible BBC. We want great programmes. The only thing people love about the BBC and what they judge it on most is what's on BBC 1 and 2, primarily.
So,
I would say beware the royals. It's almost always something to do with the royal family that gets you into trouble. And, you know, today it could very easily have happened that somebody broadcast those Prince Harry pictures on some news outlet or a programme somewhere, and there would have been all hell to pay. Peter Salmon ran into trouble with the Queen Mother's pageant because he didn't televise it. I nearly got into trouble because I said we'd downgraded plans to for the Queen Mother's funeral, and that's because the plans I inherited were the same ones from the 1950s, where basically we'd play funereal music all day and show the Union Jack running at half-mast. So there's a modernising thing. Peter Fincham
got into trouble because Peter Sissons wore the wrong coloured tie.
Yes, and Peter Fincham got into trouble because of you know, the Queen storming in rather than storming out. So, you know, beware the royals.
Sure. The last word. Beware the royals.
But yeah, the curse of the Windsors. Yeah, I think that. I think you're right. The history says it's broadcasting's version of events, dear boy, events, isn't it? The program crises come from nowhere. Look at Ross Brand, and they come from places you'd never expect them to come from. I think the real day-to-day crisis is if somehow these numbers don't quite add up, partly because of inflation.
Okay, well, I'm sure we all wish George the very best of luck. Would that he was here to hear it. But your appreciation, please, for the panel. Thank you.